What if I told you the British Empire didn't collapse on a battlefield, but on a balance sheet? In 1940, Britain still looked unstoppable on the map. Pink covered a quarter of the planet. An empire where the sun never set. A nation that had ruled the seas, controlled global trade, and financed the world for generations. From the outside, Britain looked powerful. Unbreakable. Rich beyond imagination. But beneath that image, something terrifying was happening. London was burning. Night after night, bombs fell from the sky. Streets were on fire. Factories were rubble. Civilians slept underground, not knowing if they would wake up. And while the people were told to stay strong, the men in charge knew a secret so dangerous it could never reach the public. Britain was running out of money. Not soon. Not eventually. But right now. The country wasn't just fighting Hitler. It was fighting bankruptcy. And it was losing. In a quiet underground room, Winston Churchill sat down to write a letter that would change the world forever. Not a speech. Not a declaration. A confession. A letter admitting that the richest empire in history could no longer afford to survive. That letter would pull the United States into the war. But it would also trigger a chain of deals, demands, and conditions that slowly stripped Britain of its wealth, its power, and its future. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a nation can win a war, and still lose everything. You'll see how the British Empire didn't fall. It was sold. Piece by piece. Asset by asset. Until nothing was left. Watch till the end, because the final bill for this deal wasn't paid in the 1940s. It was paid more than 60 years later. In December 1940, Britain stood alone. France had fallen. Europe was under Nazi control. And across the Atlantic, the United States was still officially neutral. No troops. No formal alliance. Just distance, laws, and hesitation. That was the moment Winston Churchill picked up his pen. This was not a public letter. It was not meant to inspire. It was meant to survive. Churchill was a master of words, but this time, every sentence carried shame. Because for the first time in modern history, Britain had to admit the unthinkable. It was broke. In his letter to President Franklin Roosevelt, Churchill laid out the military danger. German submarines were choking the Atlantic. Ships were sinking faster than they could be replaced. Planes, tanks, ammunition, fuel, everything was running out. Britain was willing to fight on the beaches and in the streets. But courage didn't buy bullets. Money did. And that money was gone. Churchill explained that Britain could no longer pay cash for American weapons. The treasury was empty. The gold was disappearing. The moment was approaching when Britain would still be alive militarily, but dead financially. It was an admission no empire had ever made so openly. For Roosevelt, the letter was explosive. He understood the stakes immediately. If Britain fell, the United States would eventually stand alone against a hostile world. But helping Britain was not simple. American law forbade direct aid. The public hated the idea of another European war. And Congress had locked the country behind neutrality acts designed to keep America out at all costs. Roosevelt now faced a dilemma. Do nothing, and watch Britain collapse. Or help Britain, and find a way to make it look legal, moral, and profitable. That letter forced a decision. And whatever choice America made next would not just decide the war. It would decide who controlled the world after it. To understand how shocking Britain's collapse was, you have to understand what Britain used to be. Before the war, Britain was not just another country. It was the banker of the world. London was the heart of global finance. Money flowed through its banks. Insurance, shipping, trade, and credit all passed through British hands. Britain held vast reserves of gold. Billions of dollars worth. It also owned an enormous web of investments across the globe. Railways in Argentina. Mines in Chile. Factories and companies inside the United States itself. British money was everywhere. The empire wasn't just about land. It was about income. Colonies sent raw materials. Britain sold finished goods back. Ships moved constantly across the oceans, protected by the world's most powerful navy. This system made Britain rich, stable, and confident. For generations, this wealth created an illusion of permanence. Wars had come and gone before. Britain had fought Napoleon. It had survived the First World War. Each time, it recovered. Each time, the empire endured. So when war broke out again in 1939, many believed this would be no different. They were wrong. This war was not about soldiers alone. It was about machines. Steel. Oil. Rubber. Food. Endless production, day and night. And here was the fatal weakness Britain could no longer hide. It depended on imports. Britain could not feed itself. It could not fuel itself. It could not supply its war without help from overseas. And when Europe fell under Nazi control, those supply lines vanished overnight. There was only one place left to turn. Across the Atlantic. To the United States. And that dependence would cost Britain everything. This war was different from every war before it. World War II was not fought with muskets and marching lines. It was fought with factories, oil fields, steel mills, and assembly lines. Victory depended on who could produce more planes, more tanks, more ships, and do it faster than the enemy. Britain understood this too late. The moment the war began, Britain's economy shifted into survival mode. Civilian production stopped. Factories were converted. Every resource was pushed toward the war effort. But there was a brutal reality Britain could not escape. It had to import almost everything. Food. Oil. Steel. Aluminum. Rubber. Even basic raw materials. And with Nazi control spreading across Europe, Britain could no longer trade with its neighbors. The island nation was cut off. Only one supplier remained. The United States. But in 1939 and 1940, America was not an ally. It was neutral. The American public wanted no part of another European disaster. Congress passed strict neutrality laws designed to keep the country out of war at all costs. Those laws contained a single loophole. It was called cash and carry. Britain could buy American weapons, fuel, and supplies. But only under two conditions. First, it had to pay in cash. Immediately. No loans. No promises. No credit. Second, Britain had to transport the goods itself, across an ocean filled with German submarines. America was happy to sell. But only for gold. So Britain paid. Day after day. Shipment after shipment. Gold left British vaults and crossed the Atlantic. To make it safer, the government launched a secret operation. The entire gold wealth of the nation was packed onto ships and sent to Canada and the United States. It was the largest movement of physical wealth in history. And it was bleeding Britain dry. By late 1940, the truth could no longer be hidden. The gold was nearly gone. The dollars were running out. Contracts for planes and tanks sat unsigned because Britain was still fighting. But financially, it was already on its knees. When Franklin Roosevelt read Churchill's letter, he didn't need convincing. He knew that if Britain collapsed, the United States would be next. An isolated America facing a hostile world was not a future he was willing to accept. But wanting to help and being able to help were two very different things. American law blocked him. The Neutrality Acts banned direct aid. The public didn't want charity for Europe. And Congress was watching closely. If Roosevelt openly handed money to Britain, it could end his presidency and split the country. So he needed a solution that sounded generous, but worked like a business deal. That solution was called Lend-Lease. To the public, Roosevelt explained it with a simple story. If your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't argue over the price of a hose. You lend it to him, put out the fire, and take it back later. It sounded reasonable. Kind. Almost friendly. But behind closed doors, the tone was very different. This was not a conversation between equals. It was a negotiation between a lender and a bankrupt client. The man enforcing the rules was the U.S. Treasury Secretary. His job was not emotion. It was protection. Before America would send a single rifle or ship a single crate of food, he demanded proof. Proof that Britain had nothing left. The United States ordered a full financial audit of the British Empire. Not just government accounts, but private wealth too. Every asset owned by British citizens anywhere in the world. The British negotiators were stunned. No ally had ever been asked to open its books like this. They were not being treated as partners in a shared war. They were being treated like a failed company under investigation. Britain tried to resist. They warned that selling long-term investments during a war would destroy their future. They argued that stripping the empire bare would leave the country unable to recover after victory. The answer from Washington was simple. Sell everything. Or get nothing. Lend-Lease would save Britain's present. But only by sacrificing its future. Once Lend-Lease negotiations began, the message from Washington was clear. Britain had to bleed. Not symbolically. Not slowly. But visibly and publicly. American officials needed proof to show Congress that Britain was truly desperate. That it wasn't hiding wealth. That American taxpayers were not being fooled. So Britain was forced into a fire sale. This was not about selling old or useless assets. It was about selling the crown jewels. Profitable companies. Strategic investments. Businesses that generated steady income and supported Britain's economy long before the war began. The most painful example was a massive American industrial company owned by British interests. It was one of the largest producers of synthetic fibers in the United States. Highly profitable. Modern. Valuable. A steady stream of dollars flowing back to Britain every year. Washington demanded it be sold. The British negotiators knew what this meant. Selling a company in wartime, under pressure, meant only one thing. The price would be crushed. Buyers knew Britain had no choice. And they took full advantage. Britain resisted at first. They warned the company was worth far more than any quick sale could deliver. They explained this wasn't excess wealth. It was future survival. The response was an ultimatum. Sell the asset. Or Lend-Lease dies. Under that pressure, the British government seized the company using emergency powers. It was taken without consent and rushed into a forced sale. American bankers handled the deal. And they drove the price down mercilessly. The company was sold for roughly half of what it was truly worth. The dollars went straight to the U.S. Treasury to pay for weapons. Britain received no long-term benefit. Worse, the British government had to compensate the original owners back home, adding to its own internal debt. That sale was a turning point. It was the moment Britain's leaders understood the truth. This was not temporary help. This was not generosity. This was asset extraction. Britain was not being rescued. It was being liquidated. As Britain was being stripped financially, it was also being strangled at sea. German submarines roamed the Atlantic. Merchant ships were sinking faster than Britain could replace them. Food, fuel, and weapons were disappearing beneath the waves. If this continued, Britain wouldn't need to be invaded. It would starve. Churchill knew what he needed. Destroyers. Fast naval ships designed to hunt submarines and protect convoys. Britain begged the United States for help. America had dozens of old destroyers sitting in its naval yards. Leftovers from the First World War. Rusting. Obsolete. Of little use to the modern U.S. Navy. Roosevelt agreed to hand them over. But not for free. Instead of money, the United States asked for something far more valuable. Long-term access. Strategic control. Power. In exchange for just 50 aging destroyers, Britain granted the United States 99-year leases on a chain of naval and air bases stretching across the Atlantic. From Newfoundland to the Caribbean. From the Bahamas to Jamaica. From Trinidad to British Guiana. This was not a small concession. Britain was handing over the keys to the Western Hemisphere. It was allowing the United States to plant military bases on British territory, bases that would project American power for generations. Think about the trade. 50 outdated ships for near-permanent control of the Atlantic Gateway. It was a geopolitical fire sale. Britain wasn't making a strategic choice. It was making a desperate one. Trading long-term dominance for short-term survival. Selling the family silver to keep the lights on. The empire still existed on paper. But its foundations were being quietly dismantled. By the time Lend-Lease was finally signed into law, Britain had almost nothing left to give. The gold was gone. The overseas investments were being sold. The bases were leased away. The treasury was empty. To the public, Lend-Lease was presented as a heroic act. America, the arsenal of democracy, saving freedom. And in a very real way, it did. Without American supplies, Britain might not have survived the war. But hidden deep inside the agreement was a single clause that would outlive the bombs and battles. It was called Article 7. The language was quiet. Technical. Easy to ignore. But its meaning was devastating. Britain agreed that after the war, it would dismantle its system of imperial preference. This system was the economic glue of the British Empire. It gave British goods special access to empire markets. Canada. Australia. India. Africa. British products were cheaper. British companies were protected. It allowed British industry to survive even when it was less efficient than its rivals. Article 7 demanded that wall come down. After the war, Britain would open its empire to free trade. American companies would be allowed to compete on equal terms. In reality, that meant they would dominate. American factories were larger, newer, and untouched by bombing. The British negotiators understood exactly what this meant. It was the end of the empire as an economic unit. They fought the clause. They warned it would destroy British industry and hollow out the empire from within. But they had no leverage left. German bombers were still overhead. Submarines were still in the Atlantic. Britain had no money and no alternatives. So they signed. With that signature, Britain didn't just secure wartime supplies. It signed away its post-war future. The empire would survive the war militarily. But economically, it was already dead. In August 1945, the war finally ended. Japan surrendered. The guns fell silent. Across Britain, people poured into the streets. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace. Strangers hugged. Bonfires burned. After 6 years of fear, loss, and sacrifice, the nightmare was over. Britain had won. It had stood alone when Europe fell. It had endured the Blitz. It had fought from the air, the sea, and the shadows. And now, at last, there was peace. Many believed the suffering was finished. They were wrong. Just 7 days after victory celebrations began, a decision was made in Washington that hit Britain harder than any German bomb. President Harry Truman signed an order that changed everything. Lend-Lease was terminated. Not slowly. Not gradually. Instantly. No grace window. No rebuilding phase. In the middle of the Atlantic, ships loaded with food, fuel, and supplies bound for Britain were ordered to turn around and sail back. The lifeline was cut without warning. The British government was stunned. They had assumed the aid would continue for a short time. That after fighting a common war, there would be understanding. Cooperation. Time to adjust from war to peace. Instead, the bill arrived the moment the fighting stopped. Britain's economy had been reshaped entirely for war. Factories no longer made consumer goods. Exports had vanished. Food and raw materials were being imported using American dollars that no longer existed. Without Lend-Lease, Britain was bankrupt overnight. Not in a year. Not in a month. But immediately. Victory had come with a hidden price. And now, Britain was being asked to pay it. With Lend-Lease gone, Britain had no safety net. The war had ended, but the economy was shattered. The country imported half its food and nearly all its raw materials. Its factories were exhausted. Its cities were damaged. And now, there was no money to pay for survival. Britain faced a financial cliff. The government turned to its greatest economic mind, John Maynard Keynes. He studied the numbers and immediately saw the danger. Without help, Britain would default. Imports would stop. Food would run out. Rationing would turn into hunger. Factories would shut down. Unemployment would explode. Keynes described it as a financial Dunkirk. There was only one option left. Britain had to beg the United States again. In late 1945, a sick and exhausted Keynes crossed the Atlantic to negotiate. He believed Britain had a moral case. Britain had fought alone for years. It had bankrupted itself holding back fascism while America stayed neutral. Surely, he believed, the United States would offer a grant. A gift. A final act of fairness. That hope died quickly. The mood in Washington had changed. The war was over. America was tired of paying for Europe. And there was deep suspicion toward Britain's new government, which openly talked about socialism and nationalizing industries. The American response was cold and direct. There would be no gift. There would be no grant. There would only be a loan. A commercial loan. With interest. Britain had no leverage. No alternatives. No time. Reluctantly, it accepted. But the money came with conditions. Conditions so dangerous that Keynes warned they could destroy the country's economy. The most lethal of all was a single requirement. The British pound would have to be made fully convertible. Keynes knew what that meant. And he knew it would end in disaster. To understand why the loan was so dangerous, you need to understand what Britain had been protecting. During the war, Britain created a closed financial system. Countries inside its trading network were paid in British pounds. But they were not allowed to exchange those pounds for US dollars. This forced them to buy British goods. It was the only way Britain could keep its industry alive while fighting a total war. The Americans wanted that system destroyed. Under the loan agreement, Britain was required to make the pound fully convertible within 1 year. That meant anyone, anywhere, holding British pounds could walk into a bank and demand US dollars in return. On paper, this was called free trade. In reality, it was a trap. Keynes warned that the moment convertibility began, the world would dump pounds. Everyone wanted American goods. American cars. American machines. American food. No one wanted British products from bombed factories and outdated industries. But Britain had no choice. In July 1947, the pound was made convertible. What happened next was exactly what Keynes had predicted. Within days, countries rushed to exchange their pounds for dollars. Britain's dollar reserves began to vanish. Money meant to last years evaporated in weeks. The outflow was so violent that government officials watched in disbelief as the nation's financial lifeblood drained away. After just 5 weeks, Britain was forced to suspend convertibility. The window was slammed shut. The government had to return to Washington and admit failure. The humiliation was complete. Britain had tried to play by American rules. And it had been crushed. This was the moment the balance of power truly shifted. Britain could no longer support allies. Could no longer police regions. Could no longer act as a global power. The empire had survived the war. But it could no longer survive peace. By early 1947, Britain reached a breaking point. The money was gone. The reserves were drained. And the government faced a reality it could no longer hide. Britain could not afford to act like a global power anymore. For decades, Britain had played the role of world manager. It protected trade routes. It stationed troops overseas. It propped up governments and blocked rivals from expanding their influence. This wasn't just pride. It was how the empire functioned. Now, that role was impossible. In February 1947, British officials sent a quiet message to Washington. It was short, direct, and humiliating. Britain informed the United States that it could no longer support Greece and Turkey. It could no longer fund troops, send aid, or stabilize the region. In simple terms, the message said this: we are broke. We are leaving. The responsibility is now yours. That message changed the world. The United States understood what it meant. If Britain stepped back, a vacuum would open. And that vacuum would be filled by the Soviet Union. So America stepped in. Not quietly. Not temporarily. But decisively. This moment gave birth to a new policy. The United States declared it would support nations threatened by communism anywhere in the world. It would fund them. Arm them. Protect them. The role Britain had played for a century now belonged to America. This was not a peaceful handover. It was a forced retreat. Britain didn't choose to give up global leadership. It was priced out of it. The empire had run out of money. And without money, power evaporates. From that point on, the world had a new center. Not London. Washington. For ordinary people in Britain, victory did not bring relief. It brought hardship. The war was over, but daily life became even harder. Rationing continued. In some cases, it became worse. Food was scarce. Fuel was limited. Homes were cold. Factories struggled to reopen because raw materials were missing. In 1947, one of the coldest winters in living memory hit the country. Snow buried cities. Coal froze in stockpiles. Power stations shut down. Electricity was rationed. People sat in dark homes wearing coats indoors, wondering how winning the war had led to this. Bread, which had never been rationed during the war, was rationed in peace. Then came another blow. In 1949, the government was forced to devalue the pound. Before the war, £1 was worth nearly $5. Overnight, it was cut to less than 3. Imports became more expensive. Living standards fell. And Britain suddenly became poorer compared to the rest of the world. But the bill didn't end there. The money Britain borrowed after the war was not symbolic. It was real debt. With real interest. Every year, the British Treasury sent payments to the United States. Through good times and bad. Through different governments and different generations. Children born long after the war were still paying for it. The final payment on that loan was made in 2006. More than 60 years after victory. For Britain, the war never truly ended. It simply changed form. From bombs and bullets, to numbers and interest rates. World War II is often told as a story of heroes and villains. Of victory and defeat. Of good triumphing over evil. And in moral terms, Britain won. Without question. It stood when others fell. It resisted when surrender seemed easier. It bought time for the world. But history is not decided by courage alone. It is decided by economics. Germany lost the war and was destroyed. Britain won the war and was exhausted. Its factories were worn down. Its markets were gone. Its wealth had been transferred, leased, or sold to survive one more day. The empire did not collapse in flames. It was dismantled in contracts. The United States did not conquer Britain with armies. It absorbed its role through deals, loans, and leverage. By the end of the war, America held most of the world's gold, controlled global finance, and dominated trade. The center of gravity had shifted permanently. When Winston Churchill wrote that letter in 1940, he saved Britain from Hitler. There was no other choice. The deal had to be made. But every deal has a price. Britain traded its future for survival. It emerged as a moral giant, but an economic shadow of its former self. The empire faded. The world moved on. And a new superpower took its place. The lesson is uncomfortable, but clear. You can win every battle. And still lose the century. You can win every battle. And still lose the century. You can win every battle. And still lose the century.